Earl Parker was one of the few people in town who loved his job. That was probably odd, because he was a gravedigger, but he liked the way it felt when he was in Whispering Pines Cemetery. The way the trees swayed in the breeze, the way the grass felt when he kicked his boots off and walked barefoot, the way he got to clean the graves and keep the plots nice and tidy, and even the atmosphere around the place made him feel good. He had heard, when he took the job 10 years ago, that some of the previous graveyard keepers didn't like living on the premise, but he'd always thought that staying here was a fringe benefit. He could go to sleep nightly with the gentle whispers of his friends in his ears. This wasn't something that he could have talked about with anyone else. He had learned early in life not to tell people that he could hear things that no one else could. When he was a child, he told everyone about the voices he heard and the things he saw, but most people just believed they were imaginary friends of a child with an overactive imagination. His mother and father had just smiled and ruffled his hair, but only one person had really understood. His grandma was the first one to tell him to keep these strange visitors to himself. It's all well and good for children to see and hear things that adults can't, but you won't be a child forever, Earl. One day, people won't think it's so innocent, and when you become a teenager, they might tell people to put you in the places that are hard to escape from. Grandma could see them too, and she'd worked hard to escape a place like that one she was talking about. Earl had spent a lot of time with his grandma. Sometimes it felt like she was the only one who understood him. She helped him when the voices or the visions got scary, and she was good at explaining the things that he saw to him. Some of the ghosts were normal people. Some of them were so normal that they didn't even seem to realize they were dead. Some of them, however, were ghastly beyond description. These were the roadside victims who had died in car accidents, the murder victims who often shambled around the scenes of crimes, and worst of all, the suicides who seemed confused. Earl knew that some people would have been horrified, some children would have been traumatized, but Earl had always tried his best to help them and speak to them. He felt like many of them just needed someone to talk to, and he didn't mind being that person. "Good morning, Earl." Earl glanced over to the woman sitting cross-legged on the ground before her grave and waved. That was Mrs. Darby, born October 14th, 1942, and died January 5th, 2005. She died in her sleep, peacefully, of a heart attack, and as she sat on the stone slab of her grave and clicked away with her knitting needles, you would have never known that she was dead. The tell was the slightly transparent nature of the old woman, and as he stopped, pretending to tend to her plot, she held up the scarf she was knitting and showed him the tassels. "My granddaughter's gonna love it," she said, and Earl said that he was sure that she would. He didn't have the heart to tell her that her granddaughter was 24 and only came by on holidays and when her mother guilted her into it. She'd never wear that scarf, not in life, but there was no sense in upsetting this perfectly nice old lady with that kind of information. Earl chatted a little as he pulled up some weeds and made her plot look acceptable. Then he said his farewells and moved on. He passed by the memorial grave for the deceased Sheriff Masterson and stopped to fuss over it a little bit. Everyone knew that Sheriff Masterson wasn't in there, especially not after it had been torn up the year before, but he still wanted it to look nice. Sheriff Masterson had always been nice to Earl, nicer than temporary Sheriff Guthrie was most of the time, but Earl supposed that wasn't entirely his fault. He was a busy guy, and he had a town to keep safe. If he got a little short with Earl from time to time, then Earl supposed that was okay. "Earl!" someone shouted, and Earl nearly tripped over one of those stone slabs that marked a burial site as he went walking past. He turned to find Mr. Adderati looking down at a stone planter with lilies growing out of it. The fella had once been a rather well-known poet before he died, or so Earl read on his headstone, but the only one who remembered him seemed to be his niece, who lived in Dahlonega. She often came to sit at his grave and read her own poetry, and Mr. Aberratty often said she had real talent. "Not like her mother," he would confide. "That woman is skilled at getting her tripe published in one magazine or another, but the real talent appears to have skipped a generation." Earl went to stand beside the shade and looked down at the lilies. "Those are lovely, Mr. Aberratty. Did your niece plant them?" Mr. Aberratty sniffed. "Certainly not. Heather knows I couldn't abide the smell of lilies. It was one of those busybodies from the Women's Auxiliary. Beautification, they say. Puh! Would you mind getting rid of them? The smell is so cloying to me." Earl said he would, and a few minutes later he had them on a cart and was trundling them away to another part of the cemetery. Mr. Aberratty could be a little stuffy, but he generally didn't bother Earl too much. Earl would put the lilies over by Miss Parsons' grave. She would appreciate that. She liked lilies, and Earl felt his skin crawl as he saw the figure floating above the old headstone, and averted his eyes as he walked past. The grave was made of hardwood, older than any of the stone markers that sat in the boneyard, and it was for a man named Edmund Tully. Tully was a well-known schoolmaster before the turn of the 19th century, and he was supposed to have seduced several of his students' mothers and led them astray. The men of the town had taken it upon themselves to chastise him, and their talk had turned to violence. They had left him on the floor of his schoolhouse, but it was said the women he had led astray took a collection and got him the plot in the cemetery. What remained of him was an amorphous creature, mostly shadows and red glowing eyes, that hovered over his grave like a beacon. It gave Earl the willies. Earl was rarely scared of the ghosts he saw, but this one definitely kept him up sometimes. It was the piercing red eyes, Earl thought. They seemed to bore into him like lamps from a ship, and they always set his teeth to chattering. Earl headed past it as quickly as he could and went to see Mrs. Parson. "Mrs. Parson," Earl said, trying not to be too loud, "I brought you something." The young woman looked up from the book that she was reading and smiled. She was sitting on the gravestone, her knees to her chest and her feet on the edge of the granite, and from this angle she was just about the loveliest person he had ever seen. She was 28, still dappled in the prime of life, and her hair was light brown and curly. She was wearing paint-spattered overalls. Some of the paint on her face even matched, and as long as Earl didn't look too closely, he could go right on pretending it was all paint. She was sitting in profile, so he could only see the left side of her, but he knew that the right side was a little harder to look at. Mrs. Parson had been working late in her downstairs studio when someone had broken in. The whole thing had been senseless. Everyone said so. Mrs. Parson hadn't kept anything in her studio or her home that was worth more than a few $100s. The man had been out of his mind, probably on drugs, and where he had gotten the firearm was anyone's guess. He'd shot her in the head as she came out of the bathroom, fresh brushes in hand, and she'd been killed instantly. She turned, smiling, giving him a good look at the ragged wound above her left eye. "They're beautiful, Early. Thank you so much." Earl smiled as he began to plant them in the planter near her grave. Despite her grisly wound, Earl had to admit that it didn't distract much from her beauty. More than beauty, she was a wonderful person to talk to, a great reader, and he had to admit to himself that he was smitten with her. As silly as it was to be in love with a ghost, he was. "Did you manage to make it to the thrift store today?" she asked, holding her knees in anticipation. "I sure did," he said, smiling to himself. She squealed a little. "And?" He reached into his pocket and laid a slightly used Danielle Steele novel on her tombstone, and she nearly leaped from the stone in joy as she rushed towards him. She couldn't hug him, she was incorporeal, but she did wrap him in a soft, cold, misty hug. Earl tried not to shudder, and when she pulled back, he smiled at her. "Will you have time later to read it to me?" Miss Parson asked. "Of course," Earl said. "Even if I didn't, I'd make time." He told Miss Parson that he'd come back later, before dark, and she thanked him for helping her. He left her staring at the book longingly, just waiting to see what lay within. Earl watched as the sun tracked down across the sky and thought about the graves he still had to clean and the ghosts he still had to greet. Not everyone left a ghost. Not every plot held a voice of its own. Earl went about his work with a whistled tune and a spring in his step. He loved his job. He loved his town. And he hoped it would be many, many more years before he had his own plot in the boneyard. Maybe he would buy the plot next to Mrs. Parson, so he could sit and read books forever. Before he died, he would stuff his pockets with enough books to keep them entertained for all of death. You only got to keep what you had on you when you died. So, if he wanted to sit and read to her, he'd have to stock up. Maybe then, as he lay beneath the shadows of her grave and smiled up at her as she smiled down at him, he'd finally have the courage to call her Margaret instead of being so formal. That thought made him blush a little, and he went about the rest of his duties with an extra bit of energy. After all, he had a date later, and he didn't want to keep the poor girl waiting.
Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's show. If you think you might like a little more spooky in your life, then please feel free to click on one of the videos we have up here. Maybe look at one of the playlists if you're trying to get caught up. I know, there's so many videos on the channel. There's so many series that are going at the same time. Sometimes you just need a little refresher course, and I gotta say, I always enjoy the views. If you're not subscribed, feel free to hit that subscribe button. Maybe hit the bell so you don't miss anything. We upload a lot on this channel, so you won't want to miss a single story as they come out. If you'd like to support the channel, you can click on the Amazon link down there. There's quite a few books in my Amazon account. You can have a look, and if you'd like a signed copy, get up with me through email, and I'll be happy to work something out with you. Also, there's links to my Patreon, and you can become a member on the channel if you'd like your spooky a little bit early. Patrons and members on the $5 tier get their videos 12 hours early. That's in the morning as opposed to in the evening. Patrons at the $10 level also get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one. Speaking of my patrons, you should see them appearing right now. Just wanted to take a minute to say how much I appreciate all of you. Patrons, subscribers, however you give to the channel. I really appreciate everything you do, and it truly touches me that you have chosen to support the channel in this way. Well, that's enough for now. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.